Hey there, I'm Joe Weems. Before we get into the video, I want to remind you about ng-conf 2023 happening in Salt Lake City, Utah on June 14th and 15th. Head over to ng-conf.org to check out the speakers, check out the talks, and to get your ticket before they all sell out. We'll see you there.
So yeah, we're going to talk about RxJs this afternoon, and we're going to spend a couple of hours on RxJs. Now, isn't it interesting that a talk called RxJs from scratch has so many people interested in it, when we were all supposed to know about RxJs, right? But still, it's one of these things that somehow is always tricky. So we're going to start from, the very beginning, how to, the core concept of RxJS, what it is. That's pretty much what I do. So my name is Alain, or just Al. I'm a GDE in web technologies, more specifically Angular. And my mission for as long as I can remember is to make learning Angular easier to everyone. And what I mean by this is I take complex topics and try to make them easier to understand. So I do a lot of technical training. I do a lot of mentoring / consulting, public speaking like this today. And yeah, we have a 2-hour workshop. I'll try to make this interactive. It's a big room, lots of people. But when we have exercises that we practice on, I'll try to be walking around. If you have any questions, you can ask me, and all of these sort of things. So yeah, angulartraining.com, that's me, that's my website. I have a blog where I post at least once a month, everything that's new in Angular, or the web in general. And yeah, I'm based in Sacramento, California, where I also organize the Angular meetup group and the Google developer group. So that's me. Okay, now, as I like to do, a few questions for everyone in the room. So with a show of hands, who is new to Angular or just started with a framework a few months ago? Okay, we have a few people. That's good, perfect. And that's the perfect audience for this talk, so you're in the right place. Now, who has some experience with Angular? Maybe a few more months, more years, 2-3 years plus of experience, but still confused by RxJS, Observables, and all of that stuff. Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of hands. Now, anyone feels comfortable with RxJS but still want to be here this afternoon? Yep, and I hear you, because even myself, I've been working with RxJS for quite some time. And when I go to a conference, if there's a talk about RxJS, I still go there. Because, hey, we never know. I might learn something new, or maybe for me, seeing a new way to present things and explain things about RxJS and all of that. So that's what we're going to do this afternoon. We're going to try to make this all nice and easy. So my slides are full of links to the code examples and the exercises we're going to work on. So I'll let you scan those links. So this link is the link to the slides themselves, and inside the slides, we're going to have links to everything we're going to cover. So once you have that link, you have all of them, basically. And then you'll be able to click around to find your way to the content. All right, trying to see if there's any phones up. Yeah, still a few. Giving you a few more seconds. All right, looks like we are good. So, what is RxJS? That's a big question. And that's the reason why you're here. So RxJs is a library that we use a lot in Angular. And the main idea behind it is to make it easy to apply reactive patterns using observables. And what we mean by this is we basically want a way to pass information between different components or services and components. So RxJs is going to enable us to do that. That's all there is to it in the end. It's a way to pass data from one place to another. So typically, we're going to have code that publishes some info. And in Angular, we all know that we have services for that. We want the business logic to be inside services so that it doesn't sit in our components, which enables us to possibly reuse those components. So services are typically going to be the publishers of information. Hey, there's a new user logged in. Here's the user info. Or, oh, I got some new data from the server. Here's the new data. It's going to publish that. And then all of the different subscribers, so all of the different components or other services that need that info, they are going to receive it. So that's the essence of what we're going to do with RxJS. And the main object that enables us to do so, it's called an observable. So the observable is what's going to allow us to do that and pass those messages between different objects in our Angular app. Now, what's important to know is that RxJS doesn't come from Angular. It's actually a shortcut for reactive extensions for JavaScript. And the library, the bigger implementation of ReactiveX has its own website, reactivex.io. And if you go there, you'll see that they have versions for Java, PHP, C, C++, Python, everything. So it's not just a JavaScript thing. It's not just an Angular thing. Everything you learn from this, you can use it on the back end with Java or .NET or anything else. So it's really the observer design pattern implemented by a library that has multiple implementations in different languages. That's really the idea. But in our case, we are doing JavaScript. So we are using ReactiveX for JavaScript, and that's our RxJS. So observables in Angular, they are in quite a few different places. And I listed the 3 most common ones in here. There are more, but these ones are typically the ones that we're gonna have to work with at one point or another. It's not in order in which we typically encounter them. The first one should really be when an HTTP request completes successfully, because if you use the HTTP client with Angular, you're going to get an observable out of it. You're going to subscribe to this, receive some data. So that's really use case number 1, because even if you're doing nothing else in our app, just making an HTTP request, you're going to have at least one observable. Second use case that's also common is watching form input values. If you use reactive forms in Angular, they give you these observables that you can subscribe to and get some data out of it and make your code reactive, meaning the user types something, you want to trigger some validation, some checks, and then display something to the user. And the third one I listed here is whenever the URL changes in the browser. So that's when you use the router activity. The route service gives you a way to get the URL params, parse those parameters, subscribe to them, that sort of thing. That's also a pretty common use case of observables. So we're going to use those to catch that info and then possibly broadcast it to several different components that need it. How do we get data from an observable? Yeah, we're starting from scratch. We subscribe to it. And an observable is an object that has a subscribe method. So we call the subscribe method, and what we pass to that subscribe method is a function. So the function, in my case, starts here. This is the parameter of the function, which is the value that we receive from that observable. And this is the body of the function, where we do something with that value. So in the case of that example, subscribing to an observable, receiving a new value, and storing it in a variable called current selection. That's all I do. So this is very similar to an event listener, right? In a sense, if we do plain JavaScript and we add the onClick event listener to a button, we're going to add onClick equals register a function that's going to run every time we click that button. This is not different at all. We just register a callback function, and it's going to be called every time there's new data, just like our event listener would be called every time the event happens. So yeah, that's the very basics. I do have a demo for that. So let's go to it. Now, size check. Is this big enough in the back? Or can I make it bigger? Thumbs up. I hear bigger too, so I'll make it bigger. What about this? That should be pretty good. So this example is something that we would have in several different kind of applications. We have a drop-down. The user can select a value in that drop-down, and we want to capture the value selected by the user. So with reactive forms, what I did is that I created a form control. Form control comes from Angular forms. And that form control is going to be bound to the drop-down here. So we create a form control, and we bind it to that select drop-down in the HTML. And that way, Angular knows that the data model and all of the features behind that form control now apply to that specific drop-down. And then in the constructor of my component, I'm using the form control, get the value changes observable out of it. So this property, value changes, is public, and it is an observable, and I'm going to subscribe to it. And when I get a new value, I'm going to store that new value in current selection. Current selection is of type string, and just so we see that something's happening, we're going to display current selection in our template as well. So that way we see the reactivity aspect of getting a new value from that subscription and displaying it on the screen. So let's test it out. I click here. Several continents show up. I select one of them, click on it, and there you go. You selected North America. So that's because that subscription here received the latest value. So what this shows us is that once we are subscribed to an observable, we're going to receive any new value that happens in that observable. So if I keep changing the continent, if I keep selecting new values, every time there's a new value selected, this gets updated. So the function here is going to run over and over and over again. So sometimes I like to compare observables to a newspaper subscription, because I'm old school. And newspaper or magazine. And basically, when you subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine, you expect to receive several issues over time, right? You subscribe for 1 year, 6 months, and then you're going to receive those issues regularly as they get printed. And when we subscribe to a magazine, there's a couple of things that we do. We pay for the subscription, but we also give our address. And we give our address so it can be delivered to us. That's what we do with the callback function. When we give a callback function to an observable, this is actually giving us our address. So the observable knows where to send that data. That's where we're going to catch that data. That's where we're going to do something with it. So this is a mailbox, in a sense. And that subscription is going to complete at some point, possibly, for instance, after 6 months, 1 year. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So what's the main use case for observables in Angular? The one that is pretty much going to be in every single application. That's making an AJAX request to the server, getting some data in the background that we download and that we display in our components. So we're going to use the HTTP client for that. It's a service from Angular. It's designed for AJAX. It works seamlessly with JSON data, meaning that if I call an endpoint to the server that returns JSON data, then Angular is automatically going to parse that data and return a JavaScript object out of it. So we don't have to deserialize the data or do anything with it. It just works out of the box. And the thing is, when we call that HTTP GET method, or post, or put, or delete, we don't get the data right away. We get an observable instead. So we have to subscribe to it in order to receive the data. And it's always the same pattern. Every time we talk about an observable, we want to get data from it, we have to subscribe. Now, we also use TypeScript in our case, right, with Angular and RxJs. And that's going to be very, very helpful, because when we subscribe to an observable, it's good to know what kind of data we're going to get out of it. So in the case of the HTTP client, for instance, we have support for generics like this, where we can say that the data we expect from the backend is going to be, in that case, an array of license plates. And that way, I have type safety all over the place in my application. So by doing this, that method down here is going to return an observable of an array of license plates. So we're going to start with the first exercise. With all of this in place, we talked about observables. We know that we can subscribe to them. We know that the HTTP client can make a request and return an observable. So we're going to add a little bit of complexity to our first example by adding a second dropdown on the screen. So we're not going to have just one dropdown to select a continent. We're going to have a second dropdown to select a country. And where things are going to be more tricky is that the countries, well, they're going to come from a server. So we're going to make a request to get a list of all of the countries, and we're going to display that data in the dropdown. And then when we select a combination of continent plus country, we want to display you selected Europe, France. So we want to get the selection from both dropdowns, from both observables in that case, and display it. So I'll let you work on this one. Don't try to do it in a way that's too complex for now. So if you already know about operators and such, don't use them yet. Just go the easiest path, like straight to the easiest way possible you can think of. Don't overthink it. Do it nice and easy. I'm going to do a 5-minute timer on this first exercise. So the timer is starting now. And if you want to get the code, so the URL is right here, stackblix.com/edit/AT-RxJS-demo1. It's going to give you that initial dropdown with the continent selection. And then you can, it's automatically going to fork the code when you get there, so you can change it. You can see the result live. Don't need to install anything. It's all in the browser. So I'll let you work on that. And if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. I'll try to walk around the room and handle questions as we do this. So if you need any help, just catch my attention, and I'll be around. And yeah, in 4 minutes, we're going to take a look at the solution together. And again, no overthinking it. This is a simple one. Just use the basics. All right, 5 minutes it is. It's always faster than expected. So who was able to get it done? Oh, not too many people. Yeah, 5 minutes go pretty fast. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the solution. And just so you know, the solutions are listed. So there are links all over the place in the slides to access those. Typically in the notes below the slide, you can go there and you would have access to the solution right away. So that's what I'm going to do now and take a look at this example. So initially we had one drop-down that was the list of continents. And this one was hard-coded. In our template, we just add all of the continents in here hard-coded in one list, and for the countries, we wanted to make it a little bit more difficult. So what we do for the countries is the following. We inject the HTTP client in our constructor, and then we use it to make a request. So HTTP get to that URL to receive some data. And once you receive that data, we assign it to a property called countries. I created a type for the country, which looks like this. So a country is a string, and it has a continent, which is also of type string. That was not needed, but just a little bit easier, a little bit nicer to read when we have proper type info. So that's a request to get our countries, and the subscription to get those. Now, because these countries are being stored in a property in here, if I want to display them in my select dropdown, I go back here, and in my templates, I'm going to have a select where the different options are repeated using ng-for. So just using ng-for, let option of countries, that's going to repeat all of these options for every single country in my list. And then the text that we display in the option is option.country. So this gives us the following, right? And so that's select number 2. In order to be able to subscribe to it, we need a form control. So form control equals country select, meaning that in the TypeScript component, we now have 2 form control objects, one country select, one continent select. And if we scroll all the way down here, we have 2 more subscriptions. So this is the continent selection subscription and the country selection subscription down here. And the drop-downs are not connected, meaning I can do things that don't make sense, like this, for instance, and that's okay for now. We're going to fix it later. So 3 observables, 3 subscriptions, and we have some data on the screen. And no overthinking it. So even if that is not ideal, that's okay. We're going to fix it later. Any questions so far? All looks good? Perfect. All good. So we're going to get into the slightly more advanced concepts little by little. And the first thing that I want to mention is that at that point, even if our code doesn't do much, what we have here on the left-hand side, that's not super easy to read, right? It is kind of verbose, and it's just 3 subscriptions, but 3 different callback functions, quite a little bit of code, not the easiest thing to read in the world. So one thing that Angular gives us to help with this is the async pipe. Because when we use the async pipe, we can subscribe to an observable directly inside our template, directly inside the HTML. So we don't have to use that subscribe code and do all of that complexity in there. So it can simplify things a little bit. Let's see if I can apply one here. So for instance, in this example, the current continent selection and the current country selection, instead of reading these properties that come from those two subscriptions, I could simplify things. I could say, well, you know what? This observable, instead of subscribing to it in here, I'm going to get rid of all of that code, and I'm going to do it in the template. So here, I'm going to do, what is the name? Continent select dot value changes. And then what do I do? That's a test. Pipe async, yep. And that should give me the exact same result. But the syntax here is slightly less complex than doing .subscribe, callback function, and all of that blah, blah, blah. Does it still work? Yes, it does. I can still select a continent and see the current value down here. So that's pretty good. I could apply the same idea to the other one. So country select dot value changes pipe async. And now I can simplify this a little bit more. And now I only have one subscribe in my component TypeScript code. So nice and tidy. And my HTML has two async pipes to subscribe to these two different things. So I can select a continent and a country, and I see the current values down here. So that's the async pipe. Now when I show this, and that's because I do a lot of teaching, people typically ask, but what if I need to know the current selection someplace else? What if I need to know what continent or what country was selected in my TypeScript code so I can do something with that? And the answer is, stay tuned. We'll see how to do that very soon. Because we can do that even when we use the async pipe. And we'll see a couple of tricks to make that happen. So async pipe is in place. Perfect. So the next things we're going to do is improve our current code. Because at that point, we have a problem, which is we can select a continent, and then we can select a country that doesn't belong to that continent. So that should not work, right? We should be able to say, if I select Europe, I should only be able to select a country that's in Europe, right? So I should not be able to select Australia. I should have a filtered list in here. And that's where in RxJS we have something that's going to come to the rescue. And that something is known as operators. Because with operators, we can take different observables, different pieces of info, and combine them to do something else. So I can take my continent selection, my country selection, combine them, and have a specific result out of this. So when we start using operators with RxJS, it's important to, because it's all about data being emitted over time, it's very common to illustrate an observable as a marble diagram. And what a marble diagram is a timeline like this one, where we illustrate when data gets emitted. So here we emit 1, 2, 3, 4, and then some time goes on with nothing being emitted, then 5, then some time goes on, and then we complete that observable. So in the case of my continent selection, this would be selecting Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, Oceania, and then we just stop, for instance. So this is going to be convenient to document operators, because sometimes it can get tricky to understand what they do. So these marble diagrams are going to be very helpful from a documentation standpoint. So what's an operator with that in mind? An operator in RxJS is a function that takes an observable, does something to it, and returns another observable. So it's kind of like a pipe, in a sense. When we use a pipe in our Angular templates, the pipe is going to take some data, do some transformation to that data, and return modified, formatted data. That's the same thing with operators. And that's probably why the name of the method to use an observable is actually called, to use an operator, is called pipe, because we can pipe multiple transformations one after the other. So these operators, we can use them to do lots of things. Probably too many things, by the way. But we're going to stick to the basics. Again, we're building little by little, starting from scratch and getting there little by little. So most common use cases for these operators are going to be transform the data that we get from an observable, because very often we get data from a server, but the data is not the way we need it, right? We have to tweak it a little bit so that it works for our component. So transforming that data, filtering that data, or sometimes concatenating data from different places into just one data source. RxJS today has over 120 operators available, which is a lot. And we're not going to talk about all of them, because it would take probably a couple of days to really properly cover the 120 of them. Instead, we're going to focus on the ones that are really the ones that you're going to need with Angular on a daily basis, the ones that are really hard to avoid, that are really the most common use cases. So if I want to apply an operator to an observable, that's how I would do it. We have my observable here. I call the pipe method. Then I call an operator. That operator is going to receive the data from the observable and do something with it. So this is a function, again, that we pass as a parameter. And that function is going to do the transformation, filtering, concatenation, whatever we want to do with that operator. This returns another observable. That's why after we do this, we subscribe to it. So we receive some data, we do some transformation to it, and then we subscribe to the result. In the case of that example, we use an operator called map, which is the one we're going to use to transform data most of the time. So map takes data from the source observable, does something to it, returns new data. In the case here of our example, we just uppercase the data and return it. So nothing too fancy. So that's another example of the map operator in action, using a marble diagram to show how it works. So this is the source observable. It emits 1, 2, 3. We apply the operator map to it. And what we do in that mapping is we take the source values and you return 10 times those values. So the result, the output of that operator is a new observable that sends 10, 20, 30. So 10 times the initial values emitted originally. Let's take a look at the demonstration here. So still using our continent and country selection example. So what do I do in this one? I take the continent selection. The value change is observable. I pipe one operator to it. And what I do is I use the map operator to extract the 3 first characters of the continent and uppercase them. And then that's what we subscribe to, and that's what we get in our current continent selection. So meaning that if I select Africa, I receive AFR all uppercase, because the map operator made that transformation right here. So the data emitted from value changes was the same. This didn't change. It always emits the full name of the continent. But before we subscribe, we say that we want something slightly different to work with. We want a 3-letter code that's all uppercase. So we use that operator to do that change, and that's what we subscribe to. So that's an example of using an operator. So back to my newspaper old school example. What's an operator in that context? So remember, when we subscribe to an observable, it's like we subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine. We're going to receive the data, and we're going to work with it. Now, the thing is, most people don't have the time to read the entire newspaper or the entire magazine. We have some stuff that we want to read out of it, some data that we're interested in, and the rest we just skip it. So an operator is going to do exactly that. It's going to focus on the data that we need from our subscription. It's going to extract the information that we want. So if you're a sports fan and only want to read the sports news from your newspaper, well, there's an operator for that, where we can focus on that specific piece of data from the magazine or the newspaper that you receive. So yeah, operators are going to be used to do all of these things: filtering, aggregating, basically changing the data to make it fit what we need to do with our subscription. So as a result, there's all sorts of operators, all of them having a very different behavior. This one, for instance, max. So max, I've never used it in a production application. Has anyone ever used it in a production application? Yeah, I would be surprised if anyone used it. But still, it's an interesting one, because unlike many of the other operators, it's not going to change every single value that goes through that operator. Instead, this one is going to wait for the original observable to stop emitting. And then it's going to emit the maximum value that was ever sent by the source observable. So here we emit 2, 30, 22, 5, 60, 1. 60 is the maximum value ever emitted. So max, in the end, is going to return 60. So if you build a stock trading application, maybe something that's going to track a value that evolves during the day, and at the end of the day, you want to display the maximum, that could be one way to do it, possibly. So that's max. And it's interesting because it doesn't emit every single value, right? It changes the flow of the data. It's going to filter out all of the individual values, only keep the maximum, and emit it at the end. Another one that is very helpful, even if when we look at it that way, it doesn't seem to do anything, is tap. Tap is one of my favorites. I use it all the time. Why is that? Because tap is a way to spy on an observable. It's a way to see what's going on within the observable. So it's great to debug, it's great to log information, and it's great to register side effects, meaning when you get data and you want to do something with it in your component, let's say if you decide to not subscribe in your TypeScript code, for instance, because you use the async pipe, well, you can use the tap operator to get a handle on your data and still be able to do something with that data in your TypeScript code. So that's where it's going to be a lifesaver, basically, that simple operator that doesn't change anything, just is a way to register some code within our flow of information to log or catch the data as it goes through our chain of operators. But yeah, tap is never going to change the data. So the data that we get from the input observable remains the same in the output observable. It's It's never going to change anything, no matter what we do in the function here. So this one would only log the data to the console. And I mentioned it's interesting for debugging purposes. Remember this example with the async pipe earlier, where I told you, well, what if I want to know what's the current selection of the continent inside my TypeScript code? That's where tap is going to be very helpful. Because now I can do something like this. I can go back to my code here. I would do this dot continent select dot value changes. I want a pipe to add an operator which is going to be tap, my friendly spy operator. And whenever a new continent is selected, I'm just going to log it to the console as an example. So if I do this, what's going to happen when I select a new continent? It's a trick question. So are we going to see something in the console or not? I heard a no. Are there any yeses? Who says it's going to be logged to the console? OK, we have a few yeses. Who says it's not going to be logged to the console? It's about the same number of people. So the only issue with what I did here is that I took the value changes observable, I pipe a transformation to it, but then I never subscribe to it. The new observable that we get out of that process is never subscribed to by anybody, because my template here is still subscribing to value changes itself, not to that new modified observable that I just created. So if I wanted to really use it, in here, I would have to say this dot continent selection. And by the way, there is this convention in the Angular world that when we have a variable that's of type observable or subject, we use a $ as a suffix to indicate that it's an observable. So I'm going to do it here. So this .continent selection observable is going to be the result of piping that info in here. And this new observable, well, I'm going to have to declare it up here. So continent selection $. It's going to be an observable of, well, the same data as before. So an array of no, not an array of country. It's just a selected continent, so that's a string. And then that's the one I would subscribe to in my template. So now I'm going to take this, and that's where I'm going to subscribe to that using the async pipe in here. And now I'm subscribing to that new observable that has the tap in place. So now the console log is going to happen because it's part of my new observable. I don't want to say stream. I said I would avoid using that word. It's part of my new process of dealing with that data. So yeah, I assigned the result of using that operator to this new observable. It's declared up here. And then we subscribe to it with the async pipe. Let's try it. I go up here, select a continent, and it shows up in the console as well. So it's working. If I select new continents, they show up in here. So the main idea is we can use the async pipe and still do some work in our component class, which is why tap is very valuable. Because it doesn't change the data, but it allows us to register some code to trigger any side effect that we want. So that's pretty good. So if you don't use tap, well, Now I'm sure you will. Most likely. Any questions on that one? All looks good. Perfect. So let's get back to here.
That line there where you said some sort of equals and then the observable type.
Mm-hmm.
If instead, if you would have assigned it in the tab, subscribe to it, is that the same thing?
So that's a very good question. So getting back to that code, where is it? So yeah, I'll repeat the question as I find where I was before. Yes, that's the one here. So this is what I did. And the question was, what if we do, so I guess what you wanted to tell me is if we don't do this, but instead subscribe in here and then do the console log in there, right? Or just subscribe in here.
I was going to assign it to that variable in the tab.
Oh, so assigning the current continent in here. Something like this. So that would work. That would allow you to store the data. I would have to declare this up here. Current continent string. It would have the proper value. Because, again, the code we put in here could be anything. You can call a method. You can do anything you want. So in that case, we just save the current selection in that variable so we can use it later, and which is more useful than console.log for sure. And yeah, now it would be in that variable. So it shows up here because we subscribed thanks to the async pipe, but still the current continent property is now up to date and has that value as well. So every time we change, now the info is in both places. And yeah, that's why type is going to be super useful, because you can really update your internal state of the component without having to subscribe in the component class. So we don't have to deal with subscribing, unsubscribing, and all of these things. So I'm going to show a couple more operators, and then we're going to practice with another exercise. And I'll be working around the room, so if you have other questions, you can ask me as we get into exercise number 2. So other example of operator, merge. So this one is different from the previous examples because it's not just applying to one observable, but it's actually taking 2 of them and merging them into one new observable. So you have data source A, data source B, you make a request to a server to get some info from one place, another request to get info from another place, and you want to merge these 2 things into just one observable. So you subscribe just once instead of twice. Merge is a way to do that, combining multiple different observables into just one. That's the idea. And finally, filter. So filter is also a pretty good one that we use fairly often, because filter takes some a filtering function as a parameter. In this example, we filter all of the values, and we only keep the ones that are greater than 10. So if the source observable emits 2, 2 is not greater than 10, doesn't pass that test, so it doesn't get emitted to the output. 30 is greater than 10, it goes through. 22 is greater than 10, it goes through. 5 doesn't, 60 goes through, 1 doesn't. So filter is pretty helpful in many scenarios where you want to, let's say, maybe filter a list of countries based on the component on the continent you selected, maybe. All sort of things, right? So I'll show you one last operator, and after that we'll take a look at RxMarbles.com. So the operator I want to show you is combineLatest. CombineLatest is going to take two different observables, and it's going to combine the last value emitted by these two. So you can do something with the last value emitted by these two different sources. So that's where marble diagrams become important and interesting. So here we emit one. We don't receive anything yet in the output of combineLatest. But when the second observable emits something, so now both of them have emitted at least one thing, combineLatest is going to be able to combine the latest value from both. And we decide how we want to combine those values. So here we just concatenate them, nice and easy. So because the combination that we do is concatenation, what we receive is 1A. This one emits 2, we receive 2A. This one emits B, we receive 2B, so the latest value from both things. That's going to be very helpful if you have a bunch of filters, like my dropdowns, continent, country. If you had many different things that you want to select, and you want to combine the latest value, the latest selection by the user for all of these dropdowns, that's the operator you want to have. So you always receive the latest data that comes from all of these different observables. So yeah, RxMarbles.com. Let's go into this one. This is probably my favorite website to learn about RxJS operators. Why? Because there's no text in it. Every time you read the description of anything RxJS related, it's impossible to understand what it means. So this is just pictures. But they're not just pictures. The nice thing about that website is that you can actually change the way data is emitted. You can drag things around, and you see the result in real time. So it's a great way to test an operator and make sure that it does what you think it does. So we were on combineLatest, for instance. If I go to the RxMarbles page for combineLatest, I can see that if I move B around here, it doesn't change much, still emits 2B. But if I make it, let's say, the first thing emitted, then it does change the flow of data. If I make it, yeah, you can move things around and see the impact it has on the output of the operator. So it's good to test multiple different scenarios and what would happen. So here we have 1A being emitted, but if C was emitted before that, then we would have received 1C because it's the latest value from that operator. So combineLatest is somewhat easy to understand. There are some crazier ones where the marble diagrams is going to be super helpful. Concat, for instance, it does help, I believe, to see what's going on here. So concat is going to take two observables and concatenate the values of the first one with the value of the second one, but still the time interval between every single emission is preserved. So if the second observable emits only after, I don't know, let's say this is 2 minutes, the 2 minutes are still going to happen in the concatenation here. And you can see that, yeah, no matter how I change things, well, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's why this is great, because you can just play around and see what the operator does. They don't have all of them on that website. There's not 120 operators, but there's plenty enough. All of the most useful ones are in here, so it's plenty enough to find what you want and yeah, test it out, drag things around to see how it works. So with all of that said, let's practice a little bit more with exercise number 2. So in exercise number 2, we are going to change our code. We are going to change our drop-down so that now when the list of the countries that we display is in sync with the continent that we have selected. So if I selected Europe, the list of countries should only have European countries. If I select North America, the list of countries should be only countries from North America. Of course, the idea is to use operators, if possible. And you get bonus points if you don't use subscribe at all. You don't have to. You can, try to get it done any way you want. But yeah, if you can think of ways to not use .subscribe, that's even better. So just like we did for the previous one, I'm going to start a 5-minute timer, which is somewhat visible in the top of my browser here. So it's running in the top right corner. And I'll be walking around the room, so if you have any questions related to that or not, let me know, and I'll be here to answer. All right, so that was 5 minutes. It goes pretty fast. So let's take a look at how we can do this. I'm going to close a few tabs here. And I'm going to try to explain the flow of things. So the idea of this exercise was, if I select a continent, let's say I select Europe in here, then the list of countries should be just the countries of Europe. And then if I switch to a different continent, same story, it's only going to display the countries for that single continent. So in order to do this, we use a combination of different observables with operators. And I added the comments in the solution here, so that's not super easy to read, which is why I have a specific slide for this. Oops. Let's go here. Let's put this full screen. Is this big enough in the back? Kind of. Not really. It's going to be hard to make this one bigger. That said, if you click on the link in the notes below the slide, you'll get access to that same StackBlitz example where all of the comments are in here. So you can read them that way inside the code here. Because yeah, the thing is, if I make things bigger, then the layout is all messed up like this, which is not easy. So let's describe what's going on in the code at that point. So first thing I do, line number 1, we make our HTTP request to receive the countries. So this I store this in an observable, so country $ equals HTTP get, and we create the observable to get the list of countries. Then we use the continent selection. The value changes observable is going to give us the latest continent selected. And we are going to combine this with the latest value from the observable of country. So I'm using the with latest from operator here, which is going to combine my continent selection with the result of the HTTP request that gets the array of all of the countries. So at that point, after line number 3, what I have in my observable is an array. That array, the first item in the array is the currently selected continent, and the second element is the list of all of the countries that came from the HTTP request. And that's because that's what with latest from is going to do. It's going to return an array with the combination of the latest value from the continent selection and the country HTTP request. So the interesting thing here is we are combining a user action, which is clicking on a drop-down, with a server-side, well, a combination of client-server-side communication, an HTTP request. And we're combining these two things into an observable that gives us the current continent and the latest list of countries. Not that they change very often, but still. So with that in mind, what do we do? In the map function, line number 4, and then 5 and 6, we have that array of 2 values. We keep the continent as is. We don't change it. But the list of countries, on the other hand, we want to change it. So that's line 3, 4, 5, 6. We use countries.filter. This is not a filter operator from RxJS. It's a filter function from a JavaScript array. And I use that to just filter all of the countries by the continent that was selected. So making sure that the continent is equal to the current selection, that returns another array of countries, which is now filtered down to what we want to have. Then I'm using the tap operator. Why do I do that? Because I don't want to subscribe in my component class. And as we saw earlier, one way to not subscribe is to use the tap operator. So we can spy the data that's going on in our observable and do something with it. So that's what I'm doing here, using tap to update my current list of countries with the list of filtered countries that we just created here. So these are the countries for the current continent. And we also reset the selection. So we make the first country of the list the default selection of the country. This line is useful because when you change the continent, if you don't do that, the previous country is still going to be selected in the dropdown. So I'm just saying that when we change the continent, we automatically select the first country of the new list, which is kind of cheating a little bit, but that's OK. I could make it empty otherwise, just make it null and it doesn't select anything. That would work too. And finally, we have the code that we had before, which is extracting the continent, 3 first letters, 2 uppercase using map. So we've changed quite a bunch. We have chained quite a bunch of different transformations, quite a bunch of different operators that, in the end, do everything that we wanted. So this is going to do the filtering, displaying the proper list, and allows us to subscribe to just one thing in the end, which is the current continent with the async pipe. So from a use case standpoint, it's nice and clean. At the end, the output is just continent $ pipe async. But yeah, the combination of operators, that's always the tricky part with RxJS. And so yeah, this code here is what we have in action right there. So yeah, when I select South America, Argentina got automatically selected because it's the first country in alphabetical order in South America. And our selection got updated. Down here, you selected SOU, so that's South America, Argentina. And this, again, is the output we receive from these 2 subscriptions, the current continent and the current country. So yeah, with RxJS, it's very often the same story. We spend a lot of time of combining multiple operators. It seems complex, and when we get to the end, it looks like magic, and we were happy with it. So this takes a lot of practice. It's not something that I would expect everyone to fully understand after a 2-hour workshop. Getting to that level of familiarity with RxJS, it's typically weeks or months of practicing with operators, trying to understand them and everything. So don't worry if it seems to be complex. It is. And the only remedy for that is really to, getting used to them, trying to use one, then two, then combining them. And over time, you'll get to the point where you can do that kind of thing. And yeah, use a lot of operators. So does that kind of code look difficult? Or is it OK? Who says it's OK? OK, we have a few OKs. Who says it should be easier than this? Yeah, it should be easier than this. I agree. And there are better options, by the way. I didn't try to optimize everything. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so one of the good things about that complexity, in a sense, is that it's all declarative, meaning that the set of transformations we apply to this is going to be one after the other in that specific order, even though all of the data we're talking about here is asynchronous. Right? We have an HTTP request, we have user events, so it's a bunch of different asynchronous things that can happen at any time, and we turn them into one streamlined set of transformations that are going to happen one after the other. So that's my way of saying that it kind of simplifies things if you see it from that perspective, right? You're not trying to combine different subscriptions, different set of callbacks that would be very difficult to do and messy. Here we have one flow of transformation that we apply one after the other. Now, in order to make this more digestible, more easier to read, easier to understand, what I would typically do, and I certainly did that when I worked on that example, is that every time I use a new operator, I would then, right after using it, oops, I just broke everything here. I would do something like this. I would do tap console log. Because if you do this, you're going to be able to see what's going to happen after you apply that operator. What does the data look like at that point? And I would just use tap after every single step, all the time. Like tap here, tap there. So you can see how your data gets changed step after step after step, and it gets easier to understand what's going on. So at dev time, definitely, I do that all the time. And that's why tap is my best friend. It's not only for side effects, it's very good for debugging and making sure that we're doing things right. So yeah, that's really one way that we can really make things a lot more visual, because then when we look at the console, as I select things, you see that it's getting logged in here, and it's going to be pretty helpful. So initially, we had Africa with 244 countries. That was after with latest from, so nothing was filtered out. And after doing that mapping, where we filter the list of countries, we're down to 59 countries in the array. So that's telling me that we did filter things out. And if I look at those objects, yeah, they are the countries of Africa. So I know that it's working. Nice thing about console log is that it's easy to explore. You can open the nodes and close them, so it's not overwhelming in terms of just logging thousands of lines of stuff in the console. You can toggle things, open them, and as a result, it's kind of easier to debug. So yeah, my approach, if you're completely new to this, is start by trying to use one operator, and don't be shy in using tap before, after, just to see what it did. And then things get a lot easier. But yeah, even after years of doing this, I still use tap all the time. So there's no way around it. It's really all about practicing, getting familiar, and And yeah, over time, it gets easier. But it's still a different way of thinking, for sure. So there's one more topic that we haven't touched on yet. And that's how to emit data with RxJS. Because everything we've done so far was subscribing to data sources that came from the Angular framework, right? We subscribe to an observable from the HTTP client, from the form control. So we consume data from observable given to us by somebody else. But what if we want to take control of things? What if we want to emit data with RxJS and say, OK, I'm creating my own service or whatever, and I want to use it to send information using RxJS to all of my components. So that's what we're going to see in that next section. So the first thing to be aware of is that we can create our own observables from scratch if we want to. It's a class with a constructor, and that's how it would work. If I want to create my own custom observable, I would do new observable of number in that case, and inside the constructor parameter is a function, and that function describes what the observable does. So the function takes one parameter, the observer, which is really, you can see it as the subscribers that are going to subscribe to that observable. When we call the next method on the observer, we're sending that data to the observer. So that's how we send a piece of info to all of our subscribers. So observer.next42 is going to send the value 42 to the subscriber. Observer.complete is going to stop the observer. It's going to say, OK, we're done emitting any data. We sent everything we had to send. Now we're good. We stop. So this simple observable here will just emit 42 and complete and done. So there's a third method that we can call on that observer, and that's error. So next sends the next value. Complete is going to complete. Error is just going to send an error if something goes wrong. So this is all very manual and very much under the hood of how we work with observables. Now, luckily enough, RxJS sometimes tries to make our life easier. And in order to make it easy and make it so we don't have to create those observables manually, there is this notion of subject in RxJS. And a subject is exactly that. It's going to be a specific type of observable that has that extra capability of also emitting the data. So it's an observable that has a next method. So we can directly call next on that subject, and it's going to emit the value to all of the subscribers. So one line of code here, subject.nextData, and then any component, any service that is subscribed to that subject would just receive it right away. So it does sound nice and easy. Subject.next, we emitting data to all of the subscribers. A best practice that you're going to see very often when we work with subjects is that we expose them as observables so that the subscribers can only subscribe to it and not use the next method. Because if you do that, then it's going to be tricky, right? If any of your components can start messing around and send data all the way around your application, you're going to end up with a lot of problems. And a lot of the errors that they talked about yesterday during the design review. The unidirectional data flow and such, that's going to be broken right away, for sure. So let's demonstrate the different types of subjects that we have. So in this example, I have two components. I have a component up here where I can select a country by clicking on a button. And I have a second component that wants to be notified when a new country gets selected. So this second component is going to subscribe to something to receive those updates. Now, this is an Angular application. We have two separate components. If we want them to communicate, best practice is to have a service to do that. So we have a country service. And since that country service is going to have to emit information to several different components, it's going to use a subject to make it happen. So inside my country service, I'm creating a subject of country, meaning that the subject is going to emit one country at a time. And the service is going to have two methods: set current country, so we can change the current country selection, and get current country, which is going to return an observable of country. Now, these two methods, the setter and the getter, they are just proxies to our subject, right? So when I set a new country, what I do is I'm calling the next method on my subject to emit the data. And when I subscribe to it, when I return the observable to subscribe, I just return my subject as an observable. And that's it. That service is now going to be able to store the current country, emit it to all of the subscribers, and have any number of components subscribe to that subject without even knowing that there is a subject involved in here, right? The components, they would just call set or get, and that's it. So that's something we can see in our code. So my card one down here, that's what it does in its initialization. Scale coding country service, get current country. That returns the observable, subscribes to it, and it's going to display the current country. So that's the yellow-green card down here. So all it does is subscribe to that service, well, to the observable from that service, and display the data. And the other one, which is this header component. So it's displaying those buttons. And when we click on any of these buttons, it's calling the setter on my country service. So component number one here calls the setter on the service. The setter is emitting data using a subject, and component number two down here is subscribed to it. So it's going to receive the data as soon as we click any of those buttons. And now we have two components that exchange information without even knowing about one another. So subjects and observables are great to do component communication in Angular by keeping things completely decoupled. The only thing that these two components share is that they both inject the country service. That's it. So does it work? If I click on Denmark, the card one down here says Denmark, Europe. If I click on another country, it shows up down here. So this works. I can click on any of these, and you can see that it's reactive in the sense that as soon as I click, the message is sent, the subscriber receives it, updates it, and everything is up and running. Now, so I'm going to show that next. I'm going to show the different types of subjects, because there is one thing that this does well and another thing that it doesn't do so well, which is what I'm going to show right away. Any questions before that? Yeah? Mm-hmm. To some extent, yes. You would do something similar using observables. So the function that you mentioned, when you receive that event, you want to call a function. You would do that with an operator, most likely, maybe using tap, for instance, to receive the data, do something with it, and then have the template display that data. So yeah, that's the same idea, but using RxJS instead of regular event listeners. Yeah. So what happens if I add another instance of that component here? If I add another card down here, here's what's happening. It's going to show up, and as soon as it shows up, well, it's going to subscribe to my service. But the thing is, if you subscribe later on, you don't receive the data that was emitted before, because a subject, in that sense, is kind of like when you turn on the TV. If you turn on the TV in the middle of a soccer game and there was 2 goals before you turn it on, well, you miss the 2 goals, right? You're not going to see them right away. That's the same thing here. I subscribed, so component card who subscribed later missed that we selected a country up here, and that's too bad, because now it doesn't have that data. So how can we fix that? We can fix that with the second type of subject that RxJS gives us, and that's a behavior subject. A behavior subject is smart enough to always emit the latest value to the current and future subscribers. So if I emit Denmark right now, the next subscriber that subscribes to that observable/subject is also going to receive Denmark. As soon as you subscribe, you receive the latest value, no matter what. So you're always up to date, which is perfect, because most of the time in our web applications, that's what we want, right? If a new component gets displayed and the component needs to know about the user session, we don't want to wait for another user to log in, right? We want the current user session right now. So the behavior subject is going to do exactly that. So let's change our service a little bit. Going back to country service. And down here, instead of using a regular simple subject, I'm going to comment this out and instead use a behavior subject. So this is a behavior subject that's always going to have the latest value emitted. Now, a behavior subject, because it's going to send something to any new subscriber, we have to pass it a default value. So here, I added the country France that I pass as a default to that subject so that we always have one country pre-selected. It could be null, by the way, or empty array or anything you want. It doesn't have to be an actual value, but it has to be something. So yeah, behavior subject of country France. So now this country is already there because the component subscribed to that service and received the new selection. The previous behavior, when I change the country, still works, gets emitted. But where it gets better is that now if I add a new subscriber, it also has that latest country. And now everyone is always up to date. So behavior subject is what we use 99% of the time, really, because of that behavior of giving us the latest data no matter what, which is very interesting and very powerful. Now, in some cases, we want more than the latest value. And for that, we have another kind of subject called the replay subject. So replay subject is going to emit any number of previous values to future subscribers. So you can say that you have a subject that's going to replay the last 10 values, for instance. If you wanted to do that, you would do the following and use a replay subject of size 10. So the parameter of the constructor is the number of items we want to replay to our new subscribers. Now, 10 is a little bit too much. I'm going to keep it 2 in here. And I'm going to add, let's do this for now. So I send Denmark. These 2 countries receive Denmark. I click on Djibouti. Both of them receive Djibouti. And by the way, it's all logged in the console as well. So card 1 received Denmark, card 2 received Denmark, 1 received Djibouti, 2 received Djibouti. Now if I had a third card, because my replay subject is going to re-emit the last 2 values, this third card is going to receive Denmark and Djibouti right away, in that order. So let's add another card component. And it says Djibouti, and it received both, one after the other. And with no delay. So it just receives all of them instantly, no matter the length of the number of items we want to replay. So this can be helpful if, let's say you want to display the last 10 notifications for a given user and keep track of the last 10. You can use a replay subject of size 10 to always have that in store, and then when a component wants to get those notifications, would subscribe to it and receive the last 10, for instance. That's a possible use case. So there is another type of subject that I've never used. This is the async subject. The async subject is kind of weird because it doesn't emit any values. So you can call next, 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 next on it. Doesn't do anything. It's only when you call complete that it's going to emit the last value ever emitted by the subject itself. So if I emit Denmark, France, whatever, the last thing I emitted was whatever. If I complete that subject, it's going to emit whatever and complete. So it's more of a kind of subject to wait for something to be fully done and then emit the result of that action or set of actions, possibly. But it's a rare use case, so never used it in a real-life application. So looking at the time, looking at the exercise. Yeah, if there's a bunch of different things going on and you don't care about the intermediate steps but only want the final result, then the async subjects would be the way to do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And its subscribers, it sends it to them. And so the behavior subject, the replay subject, does that mean it's just constantly relaying those values until it has something new? Or does it get some kind of notification that it has new subscribers? I thought the subject's supposed to be completely coupled, doesn't know anything about the subscribers. Is that correct?
So the subject itself does have an array of all of its subscribers. So every time you call subscribe, you're passing a callback function, right? You're passing a reference to a function, and that subject is going to store it. And if you have 10 subscribers, the subject object, I think there's a property that's public that we can look at and has an array of all of the observers. So we would be able to see all of these subscriptions in here. And basically, when we call next on the subject, what it does is that it's going to go through that array of subscribers, and it's going to call all of these callbacks one by one. That's really what it's doing. So that's how it can keep track of all of the subscribers and notify them when there's something new. So it's nothing fancy, really. It's something we could probably code on our own if we wanted to without too much complexity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So a default subject doesn't store anything We tell it to emit a value. It's just going to say to all of the subscribers, hey, here's the latest value, and then forget about it. A behavior subject is going to keep track of that latest value and always has it available. By the way, it's actually visible in the API of the behavior subject. When you use a behavior subject, it has a new method that other subjects do not have, and that method is getValue. So if I do country $, I can do a getValue on a behavior subject, which never happens with the regular subject. It doesn't have that. So this would be able to just give you the latest value on demand without even subscribing to it. So you can kind of, sometimes if you just want to read what was the latest and not subscribe to it, you can also do that. Not to be abused, though. But yeah, that shows us that, as you said, it's going to store it so it can replay it to new subscribers. And then the replay subject is going to do the same thing, but on any number of values that we can pass as a parameter. And there's no limit to it. You can use positive infinity here, and it would just store everything and replay everything. Not good for memory, but, but it's possible. So let's look at this one. So this is an example where we have 17 minutes left. So that's probably the last exercise we're going to do for today. So we have a service. We want to change that service so that every 30 seconds, it makes a call to the following URL to get the currency exchange rates between euro, British pounds, and US dollar. So we just want to create a service that's going to get the exchange rate for these two different currencies compared to USD, and every 30 seconds going to call again and say, hey, what are the latest values? And then, well, as you can guess, what we're going to do is we're going to emit those latest values to our subscribers. So we're going to have a subject that gets the latest exchange rates and then broadcast that info to any components that, that wants to display those exchange rates. So the code we start from is just the exchange rate service with the URL to get the data and the HTTP client. And then we have a component that's going to inject it. So that component is going to subscribe to something from the service and display the exchange rates in here. And every 30 seconds, those values would get updated. That's the idea. So I'll let you get started on that. We'll do 5 minutes. I know it's too short, but yeah, RxJS is a topic that could take days to properly get into in depth. And then we'll take a look at the solution, and we'll do a Q&A toward the end. And after the end of the session, if you have any questions for me, same thing, feel free to catch me, and I'll be happy to answer, take a look at any code. Always happy to help. It can be one or the other. So you can subscribe in the constructor or ng on init. It doesn't change much. One or the other is going to work in that case. All right, so we got to the end of the 5 minutes. So how can we implement that service? So one possible option, full RxJS based, is to use the following syntax. So timer is another operator from RxJS, and it's basically gonna emit a value. That value is gonna be a number that increases, so we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and you decide when it starts emitting So that's the first parameter, 0. So I want to start the timer right away. And then I want to emit something every 30 seconds. So it's just a way to start my clock that's going to trigger something to happen every 30 seconds. So that's what this timer does. So it creates an observable that's going to do that, and that's going to emit 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the thing is, we don't care about 1, 2, 3, 4. What we want to do every 30 seconds is to make a request to an API. So we are going to use another operator from RxJs, which is called switchMap. So what switchMap does is that it takes an observable and it's going to replace it with an entirely different observable. So here it's going to replace our timer that just sends 1, 2, 3 with another observable, which is going to be the HTTP request that we make to the server. So that instead of subscribing to something that would return 1, 2, 3, we subscribe to something that actually returns the data from that API. So switchMap is like map, but for observables. We replace an observable with an entirely different one. So we turn a click into an HTTP request. So yeah, every 30 seconds, we turn that observable into a request to our API. We're going to get a response from the API where so the response is a complex object with lots of stuff. We just remove all of the stuff we don't need. We just extract the exchange rates. We log it to the console just to make sure it's getting us what we want. And then we subscribe to it. And we're going to use a subject to emit our new exchange rates. So we can notify all of the subscribers that we have new exchange rates available. And then in our component, we would subscribe to that observable using the async pipe. An interesting syntax feature that we have in Angular in the template syntax is this one here. So you can store the result of the subscription from pipe async to a variable. So here we're going to store this inside a rates local variable. So I can use it in multiple places to read the different exchange rates that I am interested in. Because if I didn't do that, I would have to subscribe twice to the observable, one to read the exchange rate for euros, one to read the exchange rate for British pounds. In that case here, I just subscribe once, get the data in a variable, and then use that variable to display the exchange rates. So let's take a look at this one in action. That's not the solution. The solution is 7. So yeah, we got the data right there. So from a component standpoint, all we have is an observable with the exchange rates coming from our service. We inject the exchange rate service in the component, and we get the observable out of it. Then in the HTML template, we're going to subscribe using the async pipe. And the service itself is the one that's going to have all of the logic on how to make those requests every 30 seconds. So that's the process I described earlier. We launch that in the constructor so that as soon as the service gets created, we start our timer. So that's the code we talked about earlier. Only addition to it is the replay subjects. So I use a replay subject of size 1 because I don't have any default exchange rate, so I cannot really use the behavior subject. Or I guess I could and return like 0 or something as default exchange rates. That would work too. But a replay subject of size 1 is going to work for this. And then our components, so the subject itself gets exposed with get exchange rates. So that's what the component subscribes to. And now every 30 seconds, if the exchange rate changes, those numbers would automatically update So in here, I use the replace subject of size 1 because I don't have any meaningful default values for the exchange rates, right? I could make up some numbers that would be the default values, but I thought, since I don't have anything, that's fine. Initially, there would be nothing to display. Only once we get real data, then it would be replayed to our subscribers. So we wait for at least one HTTP request to happen to replay that result, basically. That's why I didn't use a behavior subject for that one. I could do something like this, but then I would need to pass those rates. What do the rates look like? Euro, GBP. So I would pass a fake object and make up some exchange rates, so make them 1, for instance. And now I can use a behavior subject because I have a default value that's of the proper type. It's just that the value would be wrong initially. Yeah? Can you say that again? Does a replace subject send? So when you subscribe to it, if there's nothing ever emitted, you don't receive anything. It's only once something gets into it that you would receive that info. And then every subscriber would receive that latest value. Yeah. The only difference really is that the behavior subject is going to re-emit just one thing, and it needs a default value. So it needs something to emit to everybody by default, right? Whereas replay doesn't need that and can re-emit any number of things. But other than that, they're very, very similar. Yeah. Sorry? So if I use the regular subject in here, the only problem if I use a regular subject is that if a component subscribes, let's say after 10 seconds, they would not receive anything until the next refresh. So there will be 20 seconds where nothing gets displayed, and then they receive the data. So that's why I need at least a replay or a behavior in here, so that instantly we get the latest rates. Yeah, no problem. So we have 1 minute left, which is not a lot. So I'm going to go through my conclusion very quickly. So RxJS, it has a lot of cool features. It has a lot of shiny things that are very interesting to get into, but there is a learning curve to it, right? It's not something that, again, a 2-hour workshop cannot get that done, that's for sure. It does require practice, getting into it, trying some of these operators, getting familiar with them and everything. There's over 120 operators available to help you out. Subjects are really the most important skill to master. So if you get familiar with behavior subject, replace subject, how to subscribe to an observable, that's really a big part of your toolkit that you can start using on a daily basis, and you don't have to worry too much about the operators. I would say that getting familiar with operators is going to come over time as you play more and more with RxJS, but yeah, don't get too worried about operators if they seem overwhelming or anything. You don't have to use them, right? You don't have to do everything with RxJS. It's optional. So I would say adopt them as you see fit and as you get familiar with them, but don't feel like you have to use them all the time, basically, is my message. And again, of all of these operators, if you know map, filter, tap, switchMap, also added fork join to the list that we didn't cover. If you know these 5, you're in a good shape. You can probably achieve 90% of what you're ever going to need with RxJS. I made it that number, but it should be roughly accurate. So yeah, if you want to get started in one place, that would be it. These 5 operators, the different subjects, and you'll be able to do quite a lot of things with RxJS. All right, thank you.